Picturesque programmers, it's Prof G, and we're going to finish up our BipTheGuy app by incorporating the SwiftUI native PhotosPicker into our app. That's going to allow users to select their own images to BIP. And while we learn about the PhotosPicker and related data types, we'll learn how to convert a PhotosPickerItem into a SwiftUI Image View. We'll work with the loadTransferrable method. This is our first async method. We'll also learn how to add an entire view to a variable for easy updating. And along the way, we'll learn the difference between try and try question mark. And you'll also get a warning about that pesky magenta bush. I can picture more big learning. Let's code. So the view we're going to work with is the SwiftUI PhotosPicker. And like our code for playing sound, since most SwiftUI apps don't use the PhotosPicker, the PhotosPicker isn't built into the core SwiftUI. We have to import it. And we do that with the statement import photos UI, note the caps. Now the PhotosPicker view is going to return an image that the user selects, and this is a special type called a PhotosPickerItem. So we need to declare a variable to hold that selected photo. And since this is going to change as our code runs, it's got to be a state variable, so we'll say at state private var, we'll call this selected photo, lower camel case, and we'll say colon, then pass in the type for our declaration, which is PhotosPickerItem. Code completion says this is a type that represents an item you use with a PhotosPicker, and we're going to put a question mark at the end. The question mark means that this is an optional, meaning it could be nil, and it is nil when our app starts because we haven't picked a photo yet. So now let's add a PhotosPicker view so our user can pick an image. And we're going to do this by replacing our button. The PhotosPicker includes a button, so we'll be able to reuse the buttons label that we wrote before, but there's more to this PhotosPicker. So just above the button, below the spacer, enter PhotosPicker and use the arrow to highlight the option with selection and label in standard type. Code completion says this creates a picker that selects an item and optionally configures the types of items to show, item encoding, and label behavior. So press return to accept this. Note this wants a binding to a PhotosPickerItem, and we just created that variable so we can enter $selected photo. Then tab over to label, press return for the trailing closure format for our label code. Then we can highlight the label code that we wrote down in the button, copy it, then paste it in the closure for the PhotosPicker, and we can delete our button. And we see we have a Photos Library button at the right, but this comes in through the PhotosPicker, not through the old button code. And by the way, you can add a button style modifier to the bottom of a PhotosPicker if you want to change it to, say, bordered prominent or another one of the button styles. But for now, let's click this, and look at that. The preview shows us the standard iOS image picker with the 6 photos that are in the default Simulator Photos library. Very cool. By the way, we want to watch out for that magenta flower bush. There's a known problem with that particular image that generates unusual errors that typically don't occur in the wild. Not sure why Apple hasn't fixed this yet. Just be aware that if you get squirrely behavior for clicking on that magenta bush, it's not you. Well, we're almost there, but if we click any of these images, the photo picker will dismiss, but we haven't done anything with the selection. So you can either click an item or click cancel, it won't matter. And let's add a little bit more code to our PhotosPicker. There are a few additional options that we could use here. Let's add a few. So after the selected photo binding variable, enter a comma before the close parenthesis, and we'll type the word matching. Now, code completion says that this requires a PHP filter. That's an optional value, see the question mark at the end. We'll press return, code completion adds the colon after this argument label, and so what are these picker filters? Enter a dot, and what we see here are a bunch of different types of media that might be in our photos library. Images, bursts, cinematic videos, live photos, panoramas, and a whole lot more. Well, for our app, we just want images. So if we select images and press return, we filter out all of the other options that might be in a photo library, but we can't use in this app. This is great because it won't even present those other options to the user. Next, I'll type a comma, enter the word encoding, select preferred encoding. This wants something called an encoding disambiguation policy. So we can enter a period. There are a bunch of different options in here. We'll select automatic, although frankly, we didn't even need this parameter since automatic is the default option. Automatic just means that iOS is going to select the best encoding for the selection. Now, when the user makes a selection, they're going to return a PhotosPickerItem. How do we use that PhotosPickerItem? Well, we can set up an onChange modifier. Remember, we learned how to use that in the Word Garden app. We used it on a text field. Well, we're going to use it here on a PhotosPicker. So enter onChange, select that, press return. And remember, the of value in here is the value that we're watching for a change. And we want to put selected photo in here, since this will be the selection that the user has made via our PhotoPicker. And then I'm going to tab over and I'm going to press return to get the trailing closure format. The new value that's passed in here is the value after our change. Now, in this case, it's exactly the same as what's inside the selected photo. So you could use either one of the values here, but it's probably best to use new value because in some instances with other views, you might want to use the value that's passed into the closure. And so now that we've got this set up, what do we do in this closure? Well, we want to take what's inside new value, this newly selected PhotosPickerItem, and put it inside the image view. Let's look at the image view. Right now we're setting this up by passing in a string, and even if we can change this string from a literal value to a variable that holds a string, that still doesn't do us any good, because the PhotosPickerItem doesn't come back as a string, it comes back as some data called a PhotosPickerItem. Well, here's what we can do. We can create a variable that will hold not simply the string, but the entire image view. And it's totally okay to do this. An image view is just a type, like a string or a double. It's a bit more complex of a type, but we can put an image view into a variable just like we can with a string or a double. And we do it like this. We can say @state private var, why don't we call this BipImage, lower camel case, and we'll set this equal to image, parens, and the string clown. This is totally valid to do in SwiftUI. Then we can replace the image declaration down here with our BipImage variable, and now when we want to change this image, we'll change BipImage, not just the string. So down here in the onChange modifier for the Photos Picker, what we want to do is something like this. BipImage equals image, passing in new value. But unfortunately, SwiftUI does not yet have an easy way to convert from a Photos Picker item into an image. What we've got to do is we've got to jump through a bunch of intermediate steps. So I've pasted in the comments to describe these steps. This is what we need to do. We need to get the data inside the Photos Picker item. Data is a generic iOS data format. Then we can use this data to create something called a UI image, which is an older Apple image type used in UIKit. Then we can take the UI image and we can create an image view that SwiftUI can use. Now my guess is that in a future update of SwiftUI there'll be a way to do this directly, but today we got to pass and convert the data a few times before we get what we want. But if we look in code completion, we can see the different options for creating an image include this thing that allows us to pass in a UI image, so as long as we can figure out a way to get from the Photos Picker item to a UI image, we're good. And this is what we'll do. To the slides. Now we're about to write some code inside the onChange modifier, and this might seem a bit gnarly because there are a few things that we haven't seen before, but I'll do my best to describe them, and the code that we write is going to be very reusable, so you should be able to repeat this technique in any app that you want to use a photo picker in, just swap out different variables. So first, to be clear, the Photos Picker will update our selected photo variable to contain the user selection. So when the photo has been selected, the closure in onChange will fire with the new selection in both the new value and the selected photo. Now here's the tricky part. Selected photo is a Photos Picker item. That's its data type. But what we see on screen is an image, a completely different data type. We can't simply do the conversion by putting the word image with parentheses around new value. That's not going to work. But we can use a special method called loadTransferrable, which will try to extract data from whatever we put in the type value here. And if we pass in data, we actually write this with a capital D data.self, then this will grab the image data from the photo picker item and store it in a generic iOS data type, which we can then use to convert to the UI image type, which we can then use to convert to a SwiftUI image type and assign that to the BIP image. Now there are two really important things to pay attention to with loadTransferrable, and we see them both in code completion. One is it says that this throws, meaning that if there is an error, it'll throw the error, which can be caught and dealt with. So we should use a try statement with this, and up until now we saw that we use try with do catch, but I'll also show you a new technique with try question mark. Now the other thing is this also includes the async keyword. We haven't seen that before. Now an async function is code that will execute without holding up the rest of the code. It lets the rest of the app continue while it waits on a result to come back. Now this is really useful if a function is being performed that might take a bit of time to complete. A good example of that is if we're getting data over the internet. Now we're not really going to notice our app with very much delay when it tries to convert the photo picker data into an image, but since this is an async function, we still need to do a few things to make the async method work. One is we need to include the keyword await on the same line as the method just before the value and method call, and the second is we need to wrap the entire call inside of a task block. This will start the code in the block, it'll await the result, it won't hold up the rest of the app, but this block will continue when it gets back the result it's waiting for. So we say that the task block runs asynchronously as opposed to synchronously, where we would wait for the result to come back before continuing. Now we can write this code a few ways. Here's one that uses do, try, catch. Now remember, since loadTransferrable throws, we have a try before we call loadTransferrable, and we put this in a do clause. And if loadTransferrable throws an error, then we catch the error down here and we deal with it in the catch curlies. Now, since this is an async function, we have the keyword await out front between try and new value, which we're using to call loadTransferrable. And also notice that this entire block of code is wrapped inside of a task block with a capital T, another thing we need to do because loadTransferrable is an async function. Now what we're doing here is we have loadTransferrable get raw data. That's the Apple generic data type, so we indicate this with a capital D data.self. And if this works, it puts the data in the constant called data lowercase d. Then we take that data and we convert it into what's called a UI image type. That's an older Apple data type for working with images that was part of UIKit. And then we use the UI image to convert this into an image, which is what we use in SwiftUI. Now we do all this again because there's no way to go directly from either a PhotosPickerItem or generic data to a SwiftUI image, but we can create a SwiftUI image from a UI image. Now this is a lot of steps. My guess is in a future update to SwiftUI, Apple's going to cut down on the number of steps needed. They actually demonstrated a shortcut technique that you could use at Worldwide Developer Conference 2022. Eventually we can use loadTransferrable to image.self instead of data.self. Unfortunately, when I recorded this video with the Xcode 14 release candidate, Apple still hadn't incorporated these changes, but what I've showed you here will work fine, and it should work fine for future versions of iOS. Now, I also mentioned I'd show you an alternative to try. Try is used for anything that throws an error, and if it throws an error, we catch the error and deal with it in the catch part of a do catch clause. Now, if we don't care about the error, then we can use try ? Instead, and this just ignores the error. The error is treated like nil. So what we're doing here is we have try ? If it works, great. The guard lets us through. If it doesn't work, we get a nil value, and we return via the else clause in guard. And while you don't have to add a print statement, I did anyway to report the error, sort of like what we would normally do in a full catch clause. Now on this slide, we have an even tighter block of code. Here we use if let. I could use an else clause down here to handle a case where try doesn't work and we have an error, but I've skipped it, and this is totally fine if you don't think that you'll ever get an error, or you don't care if you get an error and it's okay to just ignore it. So you've got three options here. Feel free to try them all out. Now you know what try ? does as well, so you don't have a catch clause in there. You can either ignore the error, or you can follow up with a nil value that's returned. And I'm going to use the first option with try, not try ? because I want to show you the weirdness that shows up with the magenta bush image. So right now, let's enter this code. Now I'm going to write the code a bit out of order in a way that I hope underscores why we enter all the code we're about to type. I'm going to delete this bip image equals image. This doesn't do anything. You can also delete the comments if you want. So first, I want the data from a new value using the loadTransferrable method. So I'm going to start out by saying let data equals new value.loadTransferrable and select the option here with just the loadTransferrable and the type and not the completion handler. And look at this. We see that this indicates that it returns something called transferable. That's just whatever data type we pass in for this type parameter here. And remember, we're going to use capital D data for this. So it'll return data where we see transferable here. But notice it has a question mark at the end. Now there's a chance this won't work, and it'll return a nil value. So instead of using let, we're going to want to use if let to unwrap this optional if it works. Now we also see this function throws, so we need a try, and we'll use try, not try ? So we're going to need a do catch clause. And we also see that this is an async function, so we need to add the await keyword and wrap this in a task block. Now, since we haven't entered the task block yet, that's why we see this red error up here. If we had started out with a task block and put this statement inside of its curly braces, we wouldn't see this error. But press return to accept this, and for the type parameter, enter capital D data.self, and that's going to convert whatever's in new value to Apple's generic data type, named data with a capital D. And so to deal with the possibility of an optional value being returned by loadTransferrable, remember that question mark at the end? Let's add an if before the let, and because this throws, let's put a try between the equal sign and the new value, and since this is async, let's also add the keyword await after that, and then we'll wrap this whole statement inside of a task clause. So capital T task, open and close curlies. We've got our if statement in between. Then we should put the if statement inside of a do statement with open and close curlies. Follow that closed curly directly with a catch, open and close curlies. And we should also put open and close curlies after our if let in the do clause. Then down in the catch, let's print out the error if this throws an error. So we'll say print, and I like to have my errors stand out with an angry emoji. It makes them easier to find in case the console has lots of print pollution. So if you type Control Command Space, that brings up this emoji selection dialog box. I have the angry emoji in my frequently used emojis, but feel free to search for whatever emoji you'd like to use. I'm going to click this mad guy. Then for the string, I'm going to enter error in all caps, colon, loading failed, string interp, and because this throws an error, inside the string interp, I can actually refer to an error value with a lowercase e. A function that throws an error will actually give that value to you. Now, you don't get error with a lowercase e if you use try with a question mark, but you do if you use straight try and it's part of the catch clause. So I'm going to put error in the string interp. See how it shows up in code completion. If it wasn't available, it wouldn't show up in code completion. Then I'm going to say dot after this and localize description. And if an error was thrown, this should return Apple's description of what that error was. Now, in between the curlies for if let, we're going to have another if let where we try to create a UI image from the data that we just extracted above this. And we do that with if let. We'll call this UI image, lower camel case, and we'll set that equal to UI image with capital U, capital double I, and select the option with data since we're going to be passing in data, press return, and enter the data with a lowercase d. That's what we want to pass in. That's this guy that we created up here. Open and close curlies. And if this works, we can create the SwiftUI image and set this to the BIP image. And we do that by saying BIP image. See how this is of type image with a capital I. That's the SwiftUI image type. Press return, set this equal to, and if we type capital I image here, this will allow us to create or initialize a new SwiftUI Image View. Select the option that shows UI image here. Mine is right up the top. You might have to scroll to find yours. We see that this creates an image from a UIKit image instance. Yep, that's what we said we needed to do. Press return to accept this. Pass in the variable UI image, lower camel case that we created in the statement above. Cool. And now for our moment of truth. In preview, let's click Photo Library. We see the photo library. None of these are things that I particularly want to BIP, but let's imagine that yellow leaf is getting all up in your grill trying to make beef. So select that, and hey, we see the image updates in our image view. Let's BIP that leaf. Ha! Take that, nature boy. Now let's click the play button and try this in the simulator. Hammer time, no errors. And why don't I show you how you can add your own images to the simulator. So I'll click Photos Library in our app. The library shows up with these same images, but I've got an image of the coronavirus on my desktop. It's in a JPEG, so I'll head over to the Finder, and I'll drag this image right into the library that was displaying on my app. And I can see the coronavirus shows up in here. If you double-click the image, you can see, yep, it was added to the library. Now let's see. I'll click the BipTheGuy arrow in the top left to go back to my app, and I don't see the new image showing up here yet. What if I double-click the Home button up top, swipe away the Photos Library app, get back into the BipTheGuy app, and there it is. So I can see my simulator now contains the coronavirus image, and that image will stay in this particular simulator. For me, it's the iPhone 14 Pro simulator, and the only way it'll go away is if I delete that image or if I head under the device menu and select Erase All Content and Settings. So that image isn't in your app, but it is part of the simulator. So let's click this, and look at that. It adds right into our app. Ooh, I want to give that thing a bip. Nice. Let's click on Photos Library. Maybe you got something against waterfall. TLC says don't go chasing them. Take that. And while we're here, I want to show you that weirdness with the magenta bush. So I'm going to move the simulator to the side so you can see the full console. And if I scroll through the console, we don't see any angry emojis in here. So no errors were thrown, at least from my code. But if I select the magenta bush, ooh, it doesn't show. So let's scroll up in the console, and there's my angry emoji. I get a localized description, cannot load representation of type public.jpg. Now, this isn't a correct error because the coronavirus image that I just used was a JPEG. So that's your warning to avoid the magenta bush. It's probably a corrupt file. Somehow it causes problems, even though I'm using the release candidate for Xcode 14. So that's it, Swifter. We pretty much built the BipTheGuy app. Now you could do more with this app if you'd like. You might, for example, want to put rounded corners around your image. I don't like to put a shadow on this image because if you use an image with a white background, I think it shows up nicer, but you might want to do this if you tend to BIP more photographs. One thing we didn't do in this is we didn't incorporate the use of a camera. Now, as of this recording, Apple's updated SwiftUI with a photo picker, but they haven't updated the camera yet. So incorporating a camera into our app using SwiftUI requires a few more extra steps, and I figure we'll table that since we're early on in our app development development journey. I suspect that the next Worldwide Developer Conference, Apple's going to include a SwiftUI native method to be able to use the camera. But in this lesson, we did accomplish lots of big learning. We learned the native SwiftUI PhotosPicker. We used loadTransferrable to move a PhotosPickerItem to a SwiftUI Image View. We used our first async method, and we learned about try ? Want one of those My Mac Builds app laptop stickers? Record a short video of you bipping something in an app that you built in this series? Tweet at me at Gallagher with the hashtag BuiltWithProfG, and if you're selected, I'll mail that out free anywhere in the world. Keep hacking, Swiftmeister. There are many more apps to come.